Brace for impact. Captain Rovan Sircon's command echoed through the cramped control room of the Titan Vanguard's flagship, his voice sharp and commanding. The walls of the ship trembled, as if they too understood the weight of the moment. A low hum thrummed underfoot, a constant reminder of the impending storm. The cold, artificial air in the room felt heavy, stale. The scent of metal and recycled oxygen mingled with the acrid taste of sweat, and the tension was palpable. "Incoming, Captain," Lieutenant Tarek Solis barked, his fingers flying across his console, eyes darting between blinking lights. Rovan's eyes never left the viewport. The darkness outside was broken by the first glimpses of enemy ships, huge, blocky silhouettes cutting through the stars with alarming speed. The Gravka fleet was upon them, their massive warships, their surface covered in jagged organic-like protrusions, seemed to exude a deadly, alien menace. They didn't care about stealth. They had never needed to. "Status," Rovan demanded, turning sharply to face his crew. His voice, steady but tight, revealed the pressure of the situation. "Powering shields, Captain. Weapons primed," came the crisp response from Sergeant Corendex. His hands were a blur navigating the ship's systems with the efficiency of a seasoned engineer. "We won't last long under their fire if we don't hit them first," Rovan muttered under his breath, hands clenching into fists. They were the predators, and humanity was the prey. The crew could feel it. The Gravka weren't interested in diplomacy. They were here to wipe humanity off the map. Rovan's mind raced. This wasn't a war, this was a hunt. And right now humanity was the hunted. "Prepare the cloaking device," Rovan snapped, his tone cutting through the air. "We strike first." It was the Titan Vanguard's ace in the hole, the stealth technology they had been secretly developing for years. The Gravka would never see them coming. For the first time, humanity had the upper hand. Before the crew could react, an explosion rattled the ship's hull. The air was sucked from the room, and the hum of the engines suddenly faltered. Tarek was thrown across his console, his body crashing into the cold steel. "Hull breach!" he shouted, struggling to regain his footing. Rovan's heart pounded. The Neptus colony, the first major target of the Gravka, had already been hit. The sudden onslaught had ripped through the outer defenses, and debris now scattered the communication channels. His stomach churned as the image of Neptus colony, once a thriving settlement, flickered on the main screen. A single desperate transmission came through, its voice faint with static. "This is Neptus. Under attack. No escape. They're here." Then, silence. "We've lost the colony." The words from Vaden Kai, his second in command, were like a slap across Rovan's face. The coldness of it hit him harder than any impact. Humanity was losing, and they hadn't even begun to fight back properly. "Get the cloaks online, now!" Rovan's voice cracked like thunder, his command cutting through the tension that had been building. The Gravka fleet loomed closer, each of their massive ships ready to annihilate anything in their path. Humanity's first real counterstrike was about to begin, and they had to be perfect. "Shields are holding, Captain," Dex said through gritted teeth, his fingers flying over his console. "But the Gravka won't stop. Not now." Rovan felt the weight of the moment, the responsibility of leading humanity into this fight. The Titan Vanguard was humanity's best shot, and they couldn't afford failure. "Prepare for launch. We're going in. Target their lead ship. First strike. We cripple their command." Rovan's jaw tightened, the words leaving his lips with the finality of a death sentence. The Titan Vanguard was about to strike first, but it wasn't going to be enough. It wasn't going to be nearly enough to stop the Gravka. They were too fast, too strong. But Rovan refused to let that be the end of humanity. With the ship cloaked and the first wave of drones deployed, Rovan watched as his crew prepared for their fight. There was no room for hesitation. There was no time for regret. Humanity had a single chance, and Rovan wasn't going to waste it. The counterstrike began, a blur of calculated precision. Cloaked ships slipped unnoticed into the heart of the Gravka fleet. From the darkness of space, human drones, designed for surgical strikes, lit up the sky with a deadly ballet of chaos. Gravka ships exploded in quick bursts of laser fire, their once imposing fleet falling apart as the Titan Vanguard's counterattack took hold. It was only the beginning. The Gravka were stunned, disoriented, scrambling to adjust. But it wouldn't last long. The Gravka weren't used to being challenged. They didn't know what they were up against. In the chaos, Rovan heard a voice in his comms. "We've done it, Captain. They're scattered. The Vanguard is ready for Phase 2. Rovan didn't smile. He didn't need to. This was just a skirmish, a minor victory in a war they were losing. But as the fire erupted in the distance, one thought struck him. Humanity had just struck back, and the Gravka would never see it coming again. "Phase 2, Rovan said, voice cold as the void outside the ship. "Prepare to move forward. The war has just begun." The Gravka had no idea what was coming. Captain Rovan Sircon leaned forward, watching the flickering lights of the laser plasma display as it showed the aftermath of the first engagement with the Gravka. Their forces had scattered. A fleeting victory, but one that left the Vanguard's fleet breathless. The enemy was not just powerful, they were relentless, tearing through human colonies like wild beasts. But humanity's response, though barely a whisper, had made its mark. The Gravka were starting to understand that they weren't hunting helpless prey anymore. Rovan's hand hovered over the display, pausing at the coordinates of Neptus Colony, the first human settlement to fall. A sharp pang of regret bit at him, but he pushed it down. Regret had no place in war. Instead, the weight of responsibility pressed heavier on his shoulders. Humanity had been forced to fight, but the Titan Vanguard, a secretive force made from the minds and hearts of humanity's greatest, was the countermeasure, humanity's last hope. He turned away from the screen, his mind wandering back to the genesis of the Titan Vanguard, to when it was born from the ashes of human survival. Years before the Gravka had arrived, when humanity was still uncertain of its place in the galaxy, a handful of forward-thinking individuals had realized the truth. Humanity was not going to be an easy conquest for the more powerful species in the universe. Rovan was one of those visionaries. He'd seen the shift before anyone else, seen the looming darkness of an unstoppable enemy like the Gravka, and he had done something about it. The Titan Vanguard had been formed in secret, drawing from the best military minds, engineers, and scientists scattered across the colonies. They were a collective of humanity's finest, working quietly, methodically, away from the watchful eyes of the galactic powers. A deadly force designed to strike only when necessary, built for this moment. The Gravka had no idea that humans were capable of designing their own advanced tech, let alone use it to defend against a galactic predator. Rovan glanced across the room where his second-in-command, Commander Vaden Kai, was going over a new report. Kai had always been the mind behind most of the Titan Vanguard's technology. His sharp intellect and obsessive nature had made him a perfect candidate for this war. "Vaden," Rovan called, his voice carrying a weight of authority. The air in the room, though calm, was thick with tension. Their entire existence had been leading up to this point. Kai's head lifted from the console, his expression as unreadable as always. "Captain, show me the new data on the cloaking technology. How are we holding up?" Rovan stepped closer to the console, eyes locked onto the screen. "Improved," Vaden said, tapping a few keys. "We've adapted the low-emission plasma stealth systems. They're more effective now. The Gravka will barely see us coming, even with their most advanced tracking systems. But the real key is our drones. I've optimized them for autonomous combat. They'll target the Gravka's weak points before their defenses can respond. The Gravka won't know what hit them." Rovan's gaze softened for a moment, but only for a brief second. Humanity was making progress, but the war was still far from won. "Good," Rovan said. "But I want you to focus on countering their shock troops next. Our tech won't do much if we can't counter their brutal force." Vaden nodded, his eyes narrowing with intent. "Understood. I'll make sure the drone fleets are ready for ground-level operations. We'll use disruptive tech on their command systems, disable their advanced sensory grids." The display flashed with the image of the Gravka flagship once more. The ship was still in orbit above Neptus, its gleaming black surface like the polished exoskeleton of a predator. The sheer scale of the ship made Robin's blood run cold. The Gravka weren't just fighters. They were engineered to be apex predators. It was a chilling thought, and humanity's survival depended on their ability to outsmart them. Rovin stepped away from the console, his boots quiet against the metallic floor. "We've come a long way since we started this," he said. "But this is only the beginning." He paused, thinking back to the time when he first proposed the creation of the Vanguard. Back then he was just a visionary. Now he was humanity's last line of defense. Baton stood behind him, now lost in his thoughts. "I remember," Kai said quietly. "When we first started building this fleet, we didn't know if we'd ever face anything like the Gravka. We weren't sure the Vanguard would even be necessary." "It had to be," Rovin replied firmly. "Because if we didn't prepare, we wouldn't have lasted." The door to the command room slid open, and Sergeant Coron Dex stepped inside. His eyes were tired, a deep-set exhaustion lining his features, but there was an unmistakable fire in his gaze. "Captain, Commander," he said, nodding sharply, "we've got a situation with the Gravka scouts in the surrounding sector. Their fleet's larger than we anticipated. Our cloaks need another calibration if we're going to stay undetected." Rovin turned to Dex, his face set. "We don't have time for calibration. We need to make sure we can hit them where it hurts." "Working on it," Dex replied, already moving to his station. "But we're pushing the limits of what we've got." Rovin knew the risks. The Gravka had already invaded Neptus colony, and humanity was still catching up. But what the Gravka didn't know, what none of the Galactic Predators knew, was that humanity had always been underestimated. And Rovon Sircon would make sure they never made that mistake again. "Get it done, Dex," Rovin ordered. "We have one shot at this, and we're taking it." The command room fell silent again, save for the rapid clicks and beeps of the crew working. Outside, the stars glistened with indifferent coldness, a reminder that the universe was vast, and humanity was just a speck in it. But they would fight. They would prove their worth. They would not be the prey. Baden's fingers danced across the control panel, setting up the next phase of their offensive. He glanced over his shoulder at Rovin. "The drones are ready, Captain, and the disruptive pulses will target their command center. They won't be able to communicate with their ships for at least 20 minutes. Rovin looked at the holographic map of the Gravka fleet, his jaw tightening. "Let's make those minutes count." And as they prepared for the next strike, a deeper shadow stretched across the galaxy. There was something far older, far more dangerous, that was watching them, manipulating events from the sidelines. The true players were still hidden. Rovin felt it in his bones. Humanity was not the only one in this game, and soon they would find out who else was pulling the strings. The clock was ticking. "Now!" Captain Rovon Sircon's voice cut through the tension in the control room like a blade. The word echoed, firm and resolute, but tinged with a quiet anticipation. His eyes were fixed on the laser plasma display as the first phase of the Titan Vanguard's counterattack launched into action. The moment had arrived. The Gravka fleet, a menacing armada of sleek, jagged ships, had been in full pursuit, focused solely on annihilating humanity's scattered colonies. But what they hadn't counted on was humanity's ability to adapt. The Titan Vanguard, in secret for years, was finally making its move. "Shields are holding," Lieutenant Tarek Solis reported from his station. His hands moved swiftly across the controls, fingers pressing the keys with precision as his sharp eyes scanned the data. Cloaked ships fully powered. Rovin's gaze swept across the room, locking eyes with the crew. "All units," he began, his tone low. "Initiate first strike. Let's show them who they're dealing with." The Titan Vanguard's fleet, cloaked and undetected, surged forward, disappearing into the shadows of space. They were invisible, ghosts in the darkness, unseen by the Gravka's once unstoppable tracking systems. Each ship in the fleet hummed with the power of humanity's cutting-edge tech, each weapon primed and ready. As Rovin's command cut through the silence, the sound of distant explosions began to break the stillness of space. Energy beams erupted from the cloaked ships, cutting through the Gravka forces like a knife through paper. The first blast tore through the hull of a Gravka scout ship, its massive frame crumpling under the sudden force. The Gravka had no chance to react. Their once impenetrable command structure was now shattered in an instant. Rovin felt the rush of adrenaline as he watched the battle unfold on the heads-up display. The Gravka were disoriented, scrambling to regain their bearings. Their sleek ships, once a symbol of unmatched power, now floated aimlessly, like predators caught in a trap. "We've hit them hard," Vaden Kai, the technology mastermind and Rovin's second-in-command, said, his voice a calm counterpoint to the chaos unfolding outside. "Their communication networks are down. They're blind." "Good," Rovin replied, his voice steady but carrying a hint of something more. "But this is just the beginning. Get ready for the next phase." The Gravka flagship, a massive, grotesque structure, loomed in the distance. It was the heart of their operation, and if humanity could strike it, the rest of their forces would fall apart. The mission was clear: cripple their command vessel and sow enough confusion to break their cohesion. "Prepare drones for deployment," Rovan ordered, his eyes narrowing. The next wave of attacks had to be swift, strategic. They had no room for error. The drones, powered by AI systems, surged forward. Hundreds of them, small but deadly, zipped through the dark, targeting weak points in the Gravka fleet. Their movements were fluid, precise. The moment they came into range, the first volley of EMP pulses went off, knocking Gravka ships out of commission one by one. The Gravka's systems were scrambling to reboot, their sensor arrays flickering helplessly in the face of humanity's technological superiority. Rovin's mind was working faster than his hands could move. Each action had to be carefully calculated. One misstep, and the Gravka would regroup and retaliate. He could already see the Gravka flagship slowly starting to maneuver. The Gravka were reacting. They were adapting, but not quickly enough. "They're regrouping," Tarek said, his fingers flying across the console. The light from the display flickered on his face, casting sharp shadows. "They're sending out reinforcements." "Then we don't give them time to breathe," Rovan responded, his voice steely. "Reinforce the strike teams. Hit them before they can recover." As the next series of EMP pulses launched from the Titan Vanguard ships, the Gravka flagship started firing back. Laser beams lanced out, cutting through the vastness of space, but the human ships were faster, moving in unpredictable patterns. They were a swarm of precision, undetectable, until it was too late. In the chaos, Rovin's mind raced. He wasn't just thinking about the Gravka, he was thinking of the larger picture. The Vanguard's success depended on more than just combat prowess. Counterintelligence was key. As Gravka reinforcements arrived, Rovin knew that the battle wasn't over. This strike had to be just enough to force the Gravka into disarray. The counterattack, when timed correctly, would cripple them for good. "We've isolated their flagship," Vaden's voice broke through the tension. "They can't communicate with their fleet anymore. We've bought ourselves some time." The Titan Vanguard's fleet pushed deeper into the heart of the Gravka armada, the drones continuing their surgical strikes. The Gravka flagship was still moving, but it was slower now. Vulnerable. Rovin's focus never wavered. "The flagship shields are starting to falter," Dex reported, his eyes glued to the radar. "It won't hold much longer." Rovin's heart beat faster as the final phase of their plan came into view. He didn't let himself feel relief. Not yet. The Gravka were dangerous, but more importantly, there was something else he couldn't shake, a feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. They had struck hard, yes, but what if there was something darker lurking behind the Gravka's assault? Something they hadn't accounted for. "Prepare for the final strike," Rovan ordered, his voice taut with anticipation. "Focus all firepower on the flagship." The final wave of attacks came in the form of a direct hit from one of the cloaked ships, followed by a well-aimed drone strike. The Gravka flagship shuddered as its shields collapsed. and the once formidable command ship exploded into a burst of light and fire, the remnants of it disintegrating into space. The Gravka fleet faltered. Panic swept through their ranks as they realized they had been struck by something far more sophisticated than they had ever imagined. They had underestimated humanity's will and their ability to strike back. For the first time in the war, the Gravka were the ones on the defensive. As Rovan stood at the helm of his flagship, watching the Gravka's retreat, his thoughts were interrupted by the flicker of the display. A new message encrypted came through. Rovan's fingers hovered over the console. He pressed a key. The screen flashed as the message decrypted. It was a warning. The Gravka weren't alone. There was something far more ancient pulling the strings, and humanity had just walked into the first part of a much darker game. The battle was over, for now, but the war was far from won. The Gravka were regrouping. Rovan Sirkin stared at the laser plasma display, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the console. The battlefield had been won, but the battle was far from over. The Gravka flagship had crumbled under the weight of humanity's first strike, but the invaders had regrouped quickly, their fleet reorganizing, bloodied but not broken. The next wave was coming, and it was going to be brutal. "We've bought ourselves time," Commander Vaden Kai said, his voice low but confident. He stood across from Rovan, eyes scanning the encrypted messages on the screen, each word carrying more weight than the last. "But they're adapting faster than we thought." Rovan nodded, his eyes narrowing as he shifted his gaze to the Gravka fleet, now more scattered and disjointed. The Gravka, always ruthless, were now growing more cunning. They were adjusting, learning from their failures. Their arrogance had been shattered, but their resolve was intact, their response methodical. Gravka shock troops, heavily armored and armed with devastating weapons, were being deployed in droves. They had come to hunt, but now they were coming to annihilate. "I want the drones ready," Rovan ordered, his voice steady despite the pressure. "We need to stay ahead of them. No more surprises." "They won't be expecting this," Vaden muttered under his breath, his fingers flying across the control panel. The screens flashed as the AI-controlled drones were activated, their flight paths ready to be unleashed. But Rovan knew one thing. Humanity had struck hard, but the Gravka were not defeated. Not yet. Their new tactic would be one of brutality. An all-out assault, overwhelming in its force, designed to crush humanity's fragile momentum. The Gravka had underestimated humanity once. It would not happen again. Vaden turned to Rovan, his eyes intense. "They've got more ships on the way. Heavily armored warships, designed for ground assaults. They're preparing for a fight they think they can win." His voice was cold, but beneath the surface, there was something else. A flicker of worry. "Their shock troops are on their way." Rovan's jaw tightened as he considered their options. They couldn't match the Gravka's numbers. They had to outsmart them. "Get the decoy ships ready. We'll send them off toward their right flank. Let's see how they react." "They're expecting us to be on the offensive. Let's make them think we're somewhere we're not." Vaden gave a sharp nod. "Misdirection. I like it." Rovan didn't need to explain further. They'd been using misdirection for weeks now, and each time the Gravka had bitten. But this time, the stakes were higher. The Gravka shock troops were formidable. They had to play it perfectly. The coldness of space loomed outside as the Titan Vanguard's fleet surged forward, cloaked and unseen by the Gravka. Humanity's ships, sleek and dark, passed like shadows. Every drone was positioned, every ship's movement calculated, a precise execution of their new plan. On the surface of Neptus colony, the Gravka shock troops began to land. Heavily armored, they moved in perfect formation, their drone-assisted weaponry tearing apart anything in their path. The planet was alive with chaos, and the Gravka were intent on wiping humanity off the map. But what they didn't know was that the Titan Vanguard wasn't just waiting. They had prepared countermeasures that would make the Gravka's ground assault seem like child's play. "Phase 1, Rovan muttered to himself, glancing at Vaden. The counterstrike was imminent. Initiate it. Vaden's fingers flew across the console, activating the drones and sending them into the Gravka shock troops' path. But these weren't just any drones. They were AI-controlled and autonomous, equipped with EMP pulses and cloaking systems to catch the enemy off guard. For the first time in their history, the Gravka found themselves overwhelmed. The AI drones swooped in from the shadows, striking with deadly precision. The Gravka shock troops' shields faltered under the sheer onslaught. Their superior weaponry couldn't compete with the human ingenuity that had been quietly building for years. The Gravka's arrogance began to fracture. The shock troops, who had been deployed as the spearhead of the invasion, were forced to retreat. Their lines broken, their forces scattering in confusion. "Prepare for Phase 2, Rovan barked. The tension in the command room was palpable, every man and woman in the vanguard working in tandem, following Rovan's lead. The Titan vanguard had already anticipated the Gravka's next move. The Gravka, stunned by humanity's sudden, unexpected counterattack, attempted to regroup. Their warships began to form defensive patterns, their shock troops scrambling for cover. The vanguard's drones were relentless, sweeping through the enemy's ranks, cutting them down one by one. The Gravka fleet, though formidable, was struggling to cope with the constant barrage from humanity's forces. But even in their confusion, the Gravka were formidable. They adapted quickly, sending out their reinforcements, more heavily armored warships and shock troops. Their internal communication systems were back online, and their next move was coming fast. They were far from defeated, but the vanguard's attack had left them unsteady, forcing them to adjust their tactics. Inside the command center, Roban's mind raced. The Gravka were far from defeated, but they were faltering. They were trying to regroup, but their arrogance had made them vulnerable. The vanguard's ability to misdirect and exploit their weaknesses is beginning to take its toll. "We can't let up," Rovan muttered, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. He looked at his team, each of them focused on their screens. "Our mission is clear. We disrupt their control, take out their command center, and we break them." Vaden nodded sharply. "Deploying the next wave of drones. They won't know what hit them." The Gravka fleet continued to move, a slow and deliberate force, but human ingenuity was not to be underestimated. Each phase of the plan, each carefully orchestrated move, was designed to keep the Gravka off balance, to make them question whether they could ever truly conquer humanity. Rovan's voice echoed through the command room again. "We've hit them, but this isn't over. The Gravka will strike back. We need to stay ahead of them." The Vanguard's fleet closed in on the Gravka flagship, the final objective of their counterstrike. But something felt off. The Gravka were playing their own game now, shifting their tactics in ways Rovan hadn't anticipated. They were beginning to learn, and their retaliation was coming fast. But humanity had a few more tricks up its sleeve. The war was far from over. The Gravka were adapting, but so were the humans. And soon, they would see the real cost of underestimating the Titan vanguard. "Shut everything down now!" Rovan Sirkin barked, his voice cutting through the tense silence of the command center. The hum of his ship's engines, once a comforting background, now felt like the eerie stillness before a storm. The radar screen flickered, then went black. The men and women in the room exchanged uneasy glances. For a moment it seemed as though the universe itself had stopped. The Titan Vanguard fleet was in position, prepared for the next strike against the Gravka. But something had changed. Rovan's hand hovered over the console, his mind racing. He'd felt the shift, the gravitational anomaly, the strange pull in the void of space. His instincts, honed over years of warfare and command, screamed that something was coming, something far bigger than the Gravka. He stood up, his fingers tapping the laser plasma display in front of him, trying to make sense of the data streaming in. Something was emerging from deep space. Something massive. The sensors couldn't pinpoint it precisely. It was like a shadow moving between the stars, so colossal it distorted the fabric of space around it. No one had ever seen a ship like it. Baton Kai's voice broke the silence, shaky but determined. "It's enormous," Captain, the sensors can't handle the size. We're talking something that dwarfs even the Gravka flagship. What is that thing? Rovin's chest tightened, but he refused to show fear. I don't know, he replied, voice calm but carrying a hidden weight. But we're about to find out. Hold positions. All ships, maintain full readiness. We can't afford to be caught off guard. The mysterious object in space was far beyond anything they had ever encountered. It wasn't just large. It had the presence of something ancient, something older than the galaxy itself. As the seconds stretched, the behemoth grew clearer on the heads-up display, its sleek, dark silhouette coming into focus against the black of space. It seemed to pulse with an eerie light, as if the ship itself was alive, breathing the void. The Gravka fleet, still regrouping from the shock of humanity's counterstrike, hesitated. For the first time, their arrogance faltered. What the hell is that? A Gravka officer's voice crackled through the comms, panic just beneath the surface. Rovin could hear the uncertainty in their tone, a crack in their confidence. Vaden spoke again, eyes wide, fingers flying over his console. Captain, this is bad. The energy readings are off the charts. It's not just a ship, it's a weapon. And it's not broadcasting any known signatures. Before Rovin could respond, a new transmission blinked across his screen, an encrypted signal cutting through the usual chatter. It was a message, but from whom no one could tell. His instincts flared again. Open it, Rovin ordered, standing tall as the comm channel was activated. The voice that emanated from the speakers was unlike anything they had heard before. It was deep, reverberating, as if the sound itself were ancient, carrying the weight of centuries of hidden knowledge. Your petty war ends now, it echoed, the coldness of the words seeping into every crevice of the command center. You are both pawns, no more than pieces in a game that spans far beyond your comprehension. The time has come to see who will inherit the galaxy, and who will perish. The message cut off abruptly, leaving only the static of an empty line in its wake. No more words followed, but the implications hung in the air like a thick fog. Rovin's mind spun, grappling with what he had just heard. Pawns. Both humanity and the Gravka. Pawns in some larger game. Who the hell was that? Vaden whispered, almost to himself, staring at the screen. I don't know, Rovin muttered, his eyes narrowed, hardening with resolve. But we're about to find out. He turned to his crew. Prepare for an imminent engagement. We're not waiting around to find out who's behind this. Get us ready to engage, now. The Gravka fleet, stunned and thrown into disarray by the sudden appearance of the massive warship, began to retreat, albeit reluctantly. It wasn't just fear of the mysterious ship, it was the dawning realization that they were no longer in control. The entire Gravka strategy had hinged on eliminating humanity, yet now, they were facing something far beyond what their vast technological arsenal could handle. Rovin, however, knew better than to assume the Gravka would simply retreat. They would adapt, as they always did. The Gravka's response would be swift and brutal, and humanity had to be ready for whatever came next. But they weren't alone anymore. The silence on the Titan Vanguard was deafening as Rovin's voice filled the air. We've been played, all of us, Rovin said. His words were calculated, his gaze fixed ahead. This war, everything we've fought for, was never just about us or the Gravka. There's something else here, and it's up to us to figure out how to deal with it. The screens before him flickered as more encrypted signals began to flood in. The Gravka were scrambling. Rovin could sense their panic from here, even without seeing their faces. They were predictable, but this force, this ancient race, was not. In the depths of the Gravka flagship, a shudder ran through the bridge as the word spread among the officers. The ancient warship had forced them to halt their operations, and the Gravka knew better than to challenge a power they didn't understand. We are not prepared for this, one of the Gravka commanders muttered, turning to face his leader. The leader, A towering figure in black, his face twisted with contempt and suspicion, growled. "Prepare for immediate deployment. Activate the secondary fleet. We won't allow our dominance to be disrupted by anything, even this." But even as he spoke, a part of him was already calculating. This was no ordinary encounter. His people were seasoned hunters, but this situation was far beyond the normal prey they had sought out for centuries. He could sense it now. Something was off. The ancient force behind the war was watching them, and soon they would have to face its wrath. The Gravka weren't just fighting humanity anymore. They were fighting a much greater power, one that could alter the course of their entire species. Back aboard the Titan Vanguard, Rovan felt the weight of the new reality sinking in. The Gravka were adapting, but their confidence was shaken. Humanity had one chance. An alliance with the Gravka was possible, but the ancient force was still out there, lurking, watching. And humanity had to decide if they were ready to risk it all. "We will fight," Rovan said, his voice full of finality. He turned back to his crew, every word cutting through the tension. "But not just against the Gravka. We fight to reclaim our future, to destroy the ones pulling the strings." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. The Gravka had been underestimating humanity. But now, both sides were facing something far worse, and they had no idea what was coming next. The blackness of space was pierced only by the soft glow of their heads-up displays, but even that was now a stark reminder of the fragile alliance between humanity and the Gravka. The harsh silence of the ship's command center was broken by the sharp beeping of an alert. The laser plasma screens flickered, and Rovan Sirkan's gaze hardened as he saw the readout. A critical Gravka command station had gone offline. Sabotaged. "Status report, Vaden." Rovan's voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge to it. Vaden Kai, standing next to him, quickly ran his fingers across the console. "It's not just the command station. The Gravka fleet's communication network has been hacked. The entire system's compromised. Someone has breached their defenses." Rovan's jaw clenched. The Titan Vanguard had made strategic alliances with the Gravka, an uneasy coalition to face the ancient race that had manipulated their war. They had learned to operate as one, or at least they had tried to. And now, just as the stakes were higher than ever, their tenuous trust was being shattered. He turned sharply to face Vaden. "Is it us? Or them?" Vaden didn't answer immediately, his eyes narrowing as he pored over the data. "I don't know, but this smells like sabotage. A human operative or a Gravka traitor. Whoever did it knows exactly what they're doing. This isn't a simple breach." Rovan's fist slammed onto the console, causing a ripple through the room. "Whoever it is," he said, his voice low but seething, "we're gonna find them, and they're gonna pay." In the Gravka flagship, Commander Corin Dex paced restlessly across the bridge. The disruption had thrown everything into chaos. He had fought alongside the humans, but the moment this warship had docked with theirs, the stench of betrayal had followed him like a shadow. Who had sabotaged their operation? And why? Was it humanity's doing? Or one of his own officers? "Get me the recon unit's reports," Corinth barked, his voice rising. A low murmuring spread across the bridge. His second-in-command, Zaruk, approached, his movements swift and deliberate, but Corinth could see the unease in his eyes. "The humans," Zaruk began, but Corin cut him off with a harsh gesture. "Don't," Corin said, glaring at him. "I'm not interested in your excuses. Fix this. Now." Zaruk nodded, but Corin knew that even if they were able to track down the traitor, the damage had already been done. This act of betrayal had dealt a crushing blow to the already fragile Gravka-human alliance. Trust was a currency neither side had enough of to spend. Back on the Titan Vanguard, the command center hummed with activity as the crew scrambled to secure their systems. Vaden and his team were pulling double duty, trying to pinpoint the origin of the breach. Rovan stood with his arms crossed, staring at the laser plasma display as the image of the Gravka fleet flashed across the screen. A strike had to be launched, but now there were more questions than answers. Who was behind the sabotage, and why now? Do we trust the Gravka still? Vaden's voice broke through the haze of Roven's thoughts. Roven exhaled sharply. Not anymore. But we don't have a choice, Vaden. The mission goes on. They couldn't afford to stop. Humanity had already been dragged into the Gravka's war, and now the Gravka were beginning to fracture. But there was still the pressing matter of the ancient manipulators pulling the strings from the shadows. The Gravka might be broken, but the ancient force was still out there, waiting, lurking. Humanity and the Gravka had no time to bleed out their wounds. If they did, the manipulators would claim victory. Commander Sirkin, we have another issue. One of the officers at the heads-up display tapped furiously at the console, his eyes wide. He hesitated. We've lost contact with the Gravka task force. They've gone dark. Roven didn't flinch. He was already 5 steps ahead. What's the timeline? 5 minutes ago, sir. No communication, no signals, just dead air. Roven's fists clenched. Sabotage. It could only be sabotage. There was no way the Gravka could have lost so many ships without inside help. Vaden's voice came from behind him, low and uncertain. They're turning on us, aren't they? Rovan looked back at his second-in-command, his eyes steely. The only question that matters now is who is turning on who. The Gravka flagship was now in a state of lockdown. Corindex had set up a security perimeter around their command center, but the familiar hum of urgency hadn't subsided. The Gravka's security forces were no longer just focused on their outer perimeter. They were scanning their own officers, their own allies, looking for the traitors in their midst. Corin didn't know whom he trusted anymore, but he had to find the sabotage and eliminate it before their fragile alliance with humanity collapsed. The saboteurs' tactics had been too precise, too calculated. No one had suspected that they would strike now, when the Gravka were already on the brink. The humans and the Gravka had formed a pact of necessity, but it was crumbling. If the sabotage continued, the alliance would be shattered, and the Gravka would fight with nothing but hatred in their hearts. Back on the Titan Vanguard, the sabotage was becoming harder to ignore. Roven stood over the strategy table, his fingers grazing the surface as he stared at the map of the Gravka positions. The lines had been drawn. Humanity had been fighting for survival, but now, everything was at risk. If this alliance broke, it would lead to nothing less than the total destruction of their combined efforts. If they couldn't work together, if their enemies could infiltrate from within, humanity's future would be sealed in blood and smoke. We're close, Vaden said, his voice coming from behind him. We'll find them. It's just a matter of time. Roven nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Betrayal wasn't just a matter of internal sabotage. He was questioning everyone now. Every officer, every alliance. Could the Gravka be trusted? Could humanity be trusted? The Gravka had started the war, but humanity would finish it. That, at least, was certain. And when they did, they would leave no trace of those who had betrayed them. The Gravka and humanity were standing on the edge of a cliff, with nothing to hold them up but the very people who might push them off. The countdown had begun. The next strike was coming, and Roven knew one thing for sure. Only one side would be left standing when this was over. Deploy the drones. All units, engage. This is the last chance we get. Roven's voice cut through the tension, each word punctuating the thick air in the Titan Vanguard's command center. His fingers were steady as he manipulated the heads-up display, eyes locked on the map of the ancient race's stronghold. Outside the massive ship's hull, the stars were mere pinpricks against the deep, endless black. The Gravka fleet had pulled into formation, and now humanity's ships, cloaked under layers of stealth tech, joined their ranks. This was no longer about humanity fighting for survival. It was about defeating the unseen enemy, the one that had manipulated both sides into a war that nearly tore the galaxy apart. Captain, we're approaching the stronghold. Shields are at optimal power, Vaden Kai reported, his hands moving quickly over the console. His face, usually calm, was now set with a grim determination. Hold steady, Rovan replied, narrowing his gaze. His heart hammered, but his expression remained impassive. The strategy they devised was their last hope. They had one shot at this, one final strike to end the conflict and expose the puppet masters. Behind them, the Gravkar warships loomed, their massive frames now shadowing the void like deadly sentinels. Commander Corin Dex's flagship was aligned with the human vessels. Despite the bitterness between the two factions, there was a strange solidarity now. The Gravkar warriors had fought their own battles in silence, and now they fought side by side with humanity. Roven's mind flickered back to their first meeting, to the harsh words exchanged, the distrust, the uneasy understanding. There had been no room for hesitation when they realized the true enemy. The ancient manipulators, a race so old they defied all understanding, had orchestrated everything, every battle, every death, every deception. And now they would pay. The laser plasma displays in the command center flickered as data streams filled the screen. The Gravka were preparing their assault, sending waves of shock troops toward the stronghold's surface. The battle had begun, and humanity was at the cusp of an uncharted abyss. Launch Phase 1, target the central power grid, Roven ordered, his voice unwavering. We hit them hard, no room for error. A low rumble shook the Titan Vanguard as its AI-controlled drones shot forward into the dark, cloaked in silence. Rovan watched as the small fleet of stealth ships blended into the void, invisible to the enemy's sensors, moving toward the ancient stronghold's power core. These drones were their cutting-edge technology, silent, swift, and deadly. As the drones neared the target, the Gravka flagship's weapons systems engaged. A wave of intense energy blasts shot out from the surface of the stronghold. The Gravka strategy was clear: fight to the bitter end, and even the humans would not survive their onslaught. But the Titan Vanguard's drones were ready, each one slipping past the heavy defenses with precision. Phase 2, Vidin said sharply, his eyes flicking to the screens as the first wave of Gravka shock troops moved toward their ground assault. Drones have disabled the outer defenses. They're preparing to retaliate. The laser plasma displays on the wall flashed again, showing the Gravka's counteroffensive. A surge of adrenaline rushed through Roven as he moved to the comm station. Activate all units. This is it. No turning back now. We fight or we die. Outside, the battle had already erupted in full force. The Gravka shock troops charged forward in a display of brute force, while the Gravka warships launched their laser barrage, a continuous stream of energy that seared through the darkness of space. Yet, for all their strength, they were unprepared for the sudden precision of humanity's response. Roven's voice came again, sharper now. Send the Gravka ground units to the rear flank. We need to make them feel the pressure. Leave nothing behind. In the midst of chaos, Vaden's voice cracked over the comms, signaling humanity's second wave. The Gravka were breaking, their military tactics unraveling as the first decoy operation, a feint designed to draw them into a trap, lured them into range. Roven's hands slammed against the console as another wave of energy blasts lit up the field. The Gravka weren't finished yet. They adapted quickly, launching a secondary line of defense. This isn't just about fighting, Vaden muttered as they watched the Gravka's countermeasure. They're desperate. The Gravka flagship fired its weapons into the chaos. They had failed to breach humanity's outer defenses, but they weren't going down without a fight. Their massive warships unleashed torrents of laser fire, shaking the battlefield. Even the combined might of humanity and the Gravka didn't seem to stand a chance against the destructive force of the manipulator's unseen hand. But in this moment, Roven wasn't focused on the immediate destruction. He watched, measured, anticipating the Gravka's next move. Now, Vaden, he barked. The AI-controlled drones launched a coordinated strike, hitting the Gravka flagship's weak points. Systems overloaded, the Gravka's weapons faltered, and their heavy artillery stopped firing. The Gravka shock troops on the ground, too, had begun to retreat under the weight of humanity's combined forces. With the Gravka reeling, a dark figure emerged from the shadows. The manipulators, a force that had been hidden until now. sent a devastating wave toward both factions, their influence far stronger than either side had realized. "You've won a battle, but you'll never win this war," the voice rumbled over the speakers. It was the manipulator's leader, the puppet master, finally revealing themselves. Their words hung in the air, thick with menace. "You think you control the board, but you are all pawns." For a moment, Rovan stood frozen. He knew they couldn't afford to hesitate. The Gravka were vulnerable, but the manipulators were not. The timing was everything. They had to strike now, before the final piece fell into place. "Move in," Rovan ordered. "Target the stronghold's core. The Gravka are pulling back. Now's our chance." The final assault had begun. Rovan, Vaden, and the Gravka forces launched a coordinated strike against the manipulator's leadership, the final push in a war that would decide the fate of the galaxy. As Rovan led the charge, the ground beneath them quaked with the force of destruction. The ancient manipulators had played their final card, but humanity had outsmarted them. Together with the Gravka, humanity would make their final stand. Their fight wasn't just for survival, it was a battle for the future. The future where humans, and perhaps even the Gravka, could once again walk free, but at what cost? The answer would be revealed when the dust settled. The battlefield, once a cacophony of destruction, was now eerily silent. Rovan Sircon stood at the edge of the crater that had once been the stronghold of the ancient manipulators. The air was thick with the scent of burnt metal and ozone, a reminder of the battle that had raged across the skies. The Gravka, now allies in the fragile peace, lingered near the wreckage of their own ships. Their faces worn with the weight of victory, the ground beneath them was littered with the debris of both human and Gravka forces, bodies of soldiers who had once fought with unyielding fury. Rovan's eyes swept over the remains, his jaw tightening as he reflected on the cost of war. Hundreds, no, thousands, had fallen. Each death was a fracture in the unity he had fought so desperately to maintain. The Titan Vanguard's mission was complete, but at a terrible price. His fingers flexed at his sides, the sting of the loss still raw. "How many did we lose, Captain?" a voice asked. It was Tarek Solis, one of Rovan's most trusted officers. His face was hollow, his eyes bloodshot from the sleepless nights spent leading their people through the chaos. "Too many," Rovan replied quietly, his voice thick with sorrow. "Too many to count." Solis nodded, glancing at the makeshift graves that had been hastily dug for those who had fallen in battle. The Titan Vanguard's own soldiers were buried side by side with the Gravka warriors, an unspoken acknowledgement of the bond they had forged in the crucible of war. Behind them, Vaden Kai surveyed the battlefield, his face set in a grim expression. "The Gravka still don't understand it, do they?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. "The cost. All of this for what?" Rovan's gaze turned toward him, his brow furrowing. "You don't have to understand everything to see what's right in front of you, Vaden. The cost was too great, but we're still standing, and that's what matters now." Kai's fingers drummed lightly against the display of his heads-up unit, his mind racing. "We were never supposed to be here, Rovan. Neither side was meant to survive this." Rovan sighed, his voice heavy. "But we did, Vaden. We fought. We won." As the first rays of dawn broke through the smoke-filled sky, the Gravka forces began to gather their wounded. Their commanders moved with precision, their disciplined motions a stark contrast to the ragtag human forces. They hadn't come together to win. They had been manipulated, twisted by an unseen enemy into pawns in a game that now seemed meaningless. "Rovan, we've done it," Commander Corin Deck said as he approached, his heavy steps stirring up the ash beneath his boots. His voice, deep and guttural, held the exhaustion of a soldier who had fought his hardest. Rovan turned to meet him. "But at what cost?" he asked, his gaze lingering on the horizon where the ancient race's stronghold still smoldered. Dex's expression hardened. "We did what was necessary." "Necessary?" Rovan repeated, the weight of the word hanging between them. "Or were we forced to?" Did we really have a choice? That's the truth of it, isn't it? Kai chimed in. We never had a choice. The Gravka didn't, and neither did we. We just kept moving forward. Kept moving forward. Rovan repeated softly. That's all we could do. The Gravka's leaders had agreed to a ceasefire, but it was fragile, held together by shared fear rather than mutual trust. The survivors, human and Gravka alike, had begun the slow process of rebuilding, though suspicion still loomed like a dark cloud overhead. As humanity's diplomats and Gravka commanders gathered to discuss terms for peace, there was little optimism in their words. Even in victory, there were no clear answers to the questions that plagued them all. Could they truly coexist? Or would the seeds of hatred buried deep in their histories continue to fester? Rovan walked through the remains of a shattered Gravka warship, his boots crunching on the scattered debris. He could feel the eyes of the enemy on him, but it was no longer the hostility that had once filled the air. There was a quiet recognition now, an understanding that had been earned through the harshest of trials. Tell me, Rovan, Kai said, approaching from behind, his footsteps barely audible in the silence. What do we do now? After everything we've lost, after everything we've endured, is it over? Rovan paused, staring out at the wreckage. No. It's never really over, is it? His voice softened. But for now, this is what we have. A chance to rebuild, to start again. The Titan Vanguard was now a shadow of its former self. The once proud fleet had been decimated, the survivors few and broken. But they were alive, and for all the pain they had suffered, that was enough. The Gravka, too, had lost many of their best warriors, none of them leaving without paying a heavy price for their part in the war. As the two factions began the long and tedious task of rebuilding their shattered worlds, Rovan couldn't help but wonder, would peace hold? Could humanity and the Gravka truly move beyond the destruction they had wrought? Some battles are never fully won, he muttered, his hand gripping the side of his ship, his eyes focused on the distant horizon. But deep inside, Rovan knew there would be no going back. The war had changed them all, shaped them into something new. There was no returning to the past. There was only the future. A future that, for the first time, had the possibility of hope. Rovan walked through the ranks of his soldiers, their faces bruised and tired but alive. Tarek Solis, his old friend, clapped him on the shoulder. You did good, Rovan. We all did. He nodded, but the weight of the words didn't settle in his chest. We did what we had to do. Now we live with the consequences. Yeah, Solis said quietly, his eyes flickering to the horizon. We live with it. As the sun rose higher, casting its light across the battlefield, Rovan stood tall. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of something different in the air. Something like peace. Something earned through sacrifice. And for the first time in a long time, Rovan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, humanity had a future in this galaxy after all. But as the Gravka commanders met with human diplomats, exchanging terms for an uneasy truce, Rovan knew that this fragile peace was not an end, but another beginning. The air in the conference hall was thick with tension, a quiet weight that pressed down on everyone present. The walls, once glistening with the pristine shine of unity, were now scarred by the aftermath of war. Outside, the remnants of the battlefield still smoldered under a cold sky. The scars of countless sacrifices burned into the fabric of the world they had fought to protect. The time for fighting had passed. Now the battle was for something far more elusive. Peace. Rovan Sirkan stood at the head of the table, his hands resting flat on the cold surface in front of him, the weight of what came next settling in his bones. His mind wandered briefly to the battlefield, the smell of burning fuel still fresh in his memory, the faces of the fallen flashing across his thoughts. Thousands had died, each one a silent cry in the winds of history. But now was the time to honor their sacrifices with action. The task ahead was monumental, but it was the only path forward. You don't trust them, do you? Came the voice of Vaden Kai cutting through the silence. Rovan didn't respond immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the laser plasma display before him, where a holographic projection of the peace agreement flickered, ready to be signed. The terms were clear. Humanity and the Grafka would form an alliance, a fragile partnership built on the shared weight of their losses. "I don't know what to trust anymore," Rovan finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But this is the only way." He glanced over at Commander Kordex, whose jaw was clenched tightly, his eyes narrowed. The Grafka had been forced to accept the terms, but the disdain in their eyes made it clear that the peace was less than certain. The old hatred still simmered beneath the surface, masked only by the need to survive. "It's not just a matter of trust, Rovan," Dex muttered, his voice as rough as sandpaper. "It's about survival. You know it as well as I do. We can't fight each other anymore. Not when there's a greater threat out there." Rovan nodded, his gaze drifting toward the Gravka delegates who stood, stone-faced, across the room. He could feel the resentment hanging between them, the barriers of years of war and mistrust still unbroken. But it wasn't just the Gravka who had to come to terms with the cost of the war. Humanity, too, bore its scars. The Titan Vanguard had been instrumental in the victory, but the human cost had been staggering, the lives lost, each one a hole in the fabric of the future. A faint whisper cut through his thoughts. "The Grafka are still plotting something," said Tariq Solis, Rovan's closest ally, as he approached from behind. "I can feel it." Rovan's gaze shifted to the far side of the room, where the Gravka commanders exchanged glances. Furtive, tense, like a storm building just below the surface. "Maybe," Rovan replied, his fingers curling around the edges of the table. "But we can't afford to let suspicion rule us. Not now. If we're going to rebuild, we have to start somewhere, even if it means we have to trust each other for a while." Solis stood silent for a moment, then stepped back, watching as the delegates began to take their seats. The weight of the peace agreement hung in the air like a thunderstorm. Humanity had been the prey for so long, caught in the relentless cycle of invasion and destruction, but now it was time for something different. The agreement they were about to sign marked the end of one chapter, but more importantly, it symbolized the beginning of a new one, a future where humanity and the Gravka would, however tenuously, stand together against the looming threats that lay in the shadow of the galaxy. The room went quiet as Rovan turned to face the gravely serious faces of the Gravka representatives. He felt the eyes of the room on him, the eyes of both the Gravka and his own people, waiting for something. The terms were clear, the stakes higher than ever. If they could hold on to this fragile peace, they might just make it out of this galaxy alive. The Gravka commander who had led their forces throughout the war, Bolaric, stood up first, his towering figure casting a shadow over the table. His voice was cold, a stark contrast to the humanity in Rovan's own tone. "You think signing this will change everything?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "You think that after everything we've done, we can just erase our past?" Rovan met his gaze without flinching. "No," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But it's a start. The past will never be erased, Bolaric. We can't forget the things we've done to each other, but we can choose to build something better." Ulrich's lips tightened, and he said nothing more, his hands clenching at his sides. The room was thick with silence for several seconds before Vadenkai spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of years of struggle. "It's not just about us, is it?" he said, his eyes meeting Rovan's. "We've learned the hard way. We've learned how far we'll go to survive. But the future? The future is for those who didn't make it, too." Rovan's breath caught in his throat as he turned back to face the display. The words were simple, but they carried with them a truth that resonated deeper than the finality of the agreement. Humanity had been through hell, and the Gravka had dragged them through it. But they had survived. They had outsmarted the greatest predators the galaxy had ever known. "We were the prey," Rovan muttered softly, looking out into the dim light of the hall. His words hung in the air for a long moment, and when he spoke again, they were louder, more sure. Now, we are the hunters. The finality of his statement echoed through the room, rippling across the silent faces that filled the hall. It was a declaration. It was a promise. Humanity had fought its battles and now, together with the Gravka, would rise from the ashes. A new power forged in the fires of war. With the flick of a button, the laser plasma display flashed to life, illuminating the faces of everyone in the room. The peace agreement was now a reality, and humanity's place in the galaxy had been forever changed. The war had taken much, but it had also given them something invaluable, a second chance. As Rovan took a step forward to finalize the agreement, the tension that had gripped him for so long began to loosen. But the cost was clear. Peace had been bought. But at what price? Only time would tell.